Hello everybody and welcome back to our study of ethics. In this lesson what we're going to do is talk about moral relativism. And we're going to spend a couple of lessons focusing on moral relativism. And the reason for that is because we've spent a couple of lessons focusing on the concept of moral absolutism, and relativism is of course the counter-argument or the contradiction to that of moral relativism. And we'll unpack both the ways in which someone can be a moral relativist, as well as looking at the concept known as cultural relativism, which is a variation of moral relativism, which will effectively disagree with a principle of relativism that we're going to talk about in this lesson. So that's what we're going to do in this lesson, okay? The last lesson, like I mentioned, we talked about moral absolutism. And moral absolutism, if we remember, was the belief that what is right or wrong, or good or bad, from an ethical perspective, will not depend on the circumstances of, for example, the society we live in, or the individual that is making that particular moral choice. The clear distinction and the clear distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad, according to a moral absolutist, is based on some universal moral truth relating to that particular topic. So murder is wrong, for example, not because of a society we live in that has agreed socially that murder is wrong, but rather because there is a moral absolute truth, that there is a universal principle that murder is wrong. That is the principle that we are establishing here. And this can be grounded on the basis of religion. For example, we can say that, well, why is it a universal truth that murder is wrong? Well, because in the Bible it says that thou shalt not kill. Or we can talk about more nebulous concepts, like, for example, human rights. We can talk about the language and the law of human rights and suggest that murder is wrong is because there is a fundamental universal principle that because you're a human being, you have the human right to life, and therefore that is why it is the case that murder is wrong or murder is immoral. That's another way in which we can ground our morally absolutist claims. Well, a counter-argument and a basic contradiction to the concept of moral absolutism is the idea of moral relativism. And that's what we're going to explore in this lesson. So moral relativism, put simply, is just the belief that there are no objective moral truths, that there isn't this sort of universal principle that, for example, murder is wrong. Moral values are therefore relative in some way. There is some kind of subjectivity attached to the concept of moral values. This may be as if we have a differentiation from society to society. So some societies may value certain moral judgments and ethical principles more than other societies, or even from the same society but from a different time period, or even if we're being hyper-fixated and hyper-specific from individual to individual. These are the different ways in which we could suggest that society that morality is relative depending on these different things. Generally speaking, there are different individuals and societies extended in space and time, so there are different societies across the world, and there are different societies within history that have had different conceptions about what it means to be good, or what it means for something to be bad, or moral, or immoral. Or if we're talking about a few more complicated topics, things like justice. What actually counts as justice according to a society 1,000 years ago might be very different to that of justice in a society today. And it means that according to relativism, there is no such thing as absolute moral truths. We only have relative moral truths. And this does bring us to a philosopher, a very modern philosopher called Richard Rorty, who died only very recently, in fact. And Rorty, for the most part, philosophers will often take the view that it is, say, different societies that have conceptual frameworks for what constitutes good ethical action. So, for example, in a society like the one we live in, it is generally the case that murder is considered to be wrong, and it is generally accepted among everybody within society that this is the case. And this is how most moral relativists view and understand the concept of moral relativism. The idea that it is differentiation between society or from different geographical locations or from different time periods. But Richard Rorty is very different. Richard Rorty believed that morality was a much more individualistic concept, and relativistic morality has to be individualistic in nature. According to Rorty, the individual ought to be the one who is freely able to develop his or her own moral framework. So rather than it differentiating from society to society when it comes to moral values, according to Rorty, these things are differentiated from individual to individual, which is a much more individualistic way in which we can understand ethics. And it means that the moral framework does not just apply across societies, but instead is delineated based on each individual. One individual may say that murder is actually morally good. I believe that morally, for whatever reason, that murder is morally good. And this might be an individual ethical principle. And this concept of moral relativism that is watered down all the way to that of the individual is known as subjective relativism. So subjective relativism takes the view that moral relativism is true, but it is subjective. It is dependent on the subject, and the subject in question is the individual. According to subjective relativism, morality does not depend on the customs or the values or the principles of a particular group or even a particular society. It depends on the principles and values that you ascribe to yourself as an individual. And in this way, one could describe morality in the same way as we describe aesthetic value, just a matter of personal preference. So if we were in a philosophy of art class, or we were in an aesthetics, doing an aesthetics set of lessons, what we would be talking about is, on one hand, there is a subjective element to aesthetic value. Some people might think that one painting looks very, very nice and it looks aesthetically beautiful, whereas another individual might say that it is not. Aesthetics isn't something that is based on principles that we can spread across from society to society. Rather, aesthetics is something that is very, very personal and very, very individualistic. And according to subjective relativism, one could actually make this kind of description and make this kind of comparison to that of morality. This is slightly problematic in the sense that if subjective relativism is to be accepted, if we were to accept Rorty's suggestion and belief in subjective relativism, then technically, how can anybody have a true disagreement about the morality of one's actions? If someone acts in a way that is different to you, morally, maybe according to the framework, what they're doing, maybe according to your framework, they're being immoral in that action, then this isn't a criticism you can levy at them, since they are just following their own moral framework. In the same way that if we're talking about aesthetic value, or we're talking about what makes something aesthetically attractive, something that is beautiful versus something that is not, that is not something that you can ascribe your own personal preference to other people. You can debate back and forth until the cows come home about what actually constitutes good aesthetics, what actually constitutes what constitutes beauty. But in reality, you can't say to somebody that your opinion is better than their opinion, because it is completely subjective. So if we were to make the same kind of comparison to that of morality, then you can't necessarily say that your morality is is better than anybody else's morality. It is just a different framework by which you come to moral conclusions. And that's one of the criticisms that one can levy against the concept of subjective relativism. The final thing that we can talk about, as almost a response to this concept of subjective relativism and the criticism that I've just levied to it there, is the idea of internal consistency. The only time one can ever have a debate about whether or not an individual has acted morally or immorally under a system of subjective relativism, as we're describing it here, is if they were to act inconsistently within their own internal moral framework. So if we know that an individual believes internally that the idea of murder is morally wrong, then in that instance, if they were to then go and do murder, or they were to go and support somebody being murdered, what they are doing is being internally inconsistent with their own principles, with their own foundational relativistic moral perspective. So in that regard, you could argue that they were being inconsistent, and you can make a criticism and you can levy criticism against that individual in that particular regard. The only time one is immoral according to a pure subjective relativism is if they have broken their own internal rules. Now, we'll come to note that in reality, people break their own internal rules all the time, and so we could probably levy plenty of criticism against people if we were to even accept a pure subjective relativism. So, whereas the criticism that, for example, you can't you can't suggest, for example, that someone is being immoral if they are following their own internal consistency, in reality, we can still criticize that person because of their own internal consistency. And as a result of that, if they are acting inconsistently within their own moral framework, then we can suggest that they are acting immoral. Your neighbor may have no ethical obligation within their own subjective morality to help those who are in need. And this means that if if you do have that internal obligation yourself, your neighbor does not, and therefore they will not be acting inconsistent with their subjective morality. However, if they did have that particular subjective framework that they had, that they should believe that morality, they believe it is moral for them to help those in need, and they decide not to, then they would be inconsistent within that belief. So, you can make these criticisms, you can levy these criticisms at other individuals, you can levy these criticisms at subjective relativism more broadly, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of people tend to reject this very pure, very individualistic version of relativism, and instead attempt to understand more of a cultural relativism perspective, which is what we're going to talk about in the next lesson.